Let's start. You've done an extraordinary analysis, and we'll provide a link for it, but everybody who's listening to this knows how to find you in trigonometry anyway, of this British election. You're saying that it isn't a great big lurch to the left at all, even though on the surface of it, that's what it looks like.
Well, first of all, analyzing anything like what's happened, it reminds me, my grandfather was an astrophysicist, and I once asked him about these colliders, the Large Hadron Collider and all the others. Why do they do this? And how does that work? And he said, basically, the way that we understand subatomic particles is equivalent to taking a grand piano, throwing it off a 10-story building, and then trying to work out what its purpose is from picking up the different pieces. And it seems to me that's kind of where we are with the UK election. There's been this big disaster for the Conservatives, all sorts of strange things happening. And the one clear takeaway from this is quite obviously that the Conservatives lost this election to Reform. They didn't lose it to the Labour Party. The Labour Party vote share is as low as it gets, 33.7%. For context, Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 lost the election with 40% of the vote. So the Conservatives lost to Reform, who got over 4 million votes. Not only that, the Conservatives also lost millions of votes to apathy. Their voters simply didn't come out and vote for them. And so what this really represents is the breakdown of the Conservative Party. And the reason they're breaking down, despite what many of their MPs are trying to say, which is, we were too extreme, when we're not moderate enough. On the contrary, given where those votes went, it's quite clear that the Conservative Party was not seen as sufficiently conservative by its own voter base. And so that's the first piece, I think. The second piece is, what does this mean for the future? And this is where I think it gets really, simultaneously depressing and interesting, because I was actually struck when I was in Australia at a dinner at which there were people from both sides of the political spectrum. And one of the people there, one of your former senior leaders, said, I don't want the other party to win, but when they do, and they will win at some point, I want them to be the best possible government for Australia. Likewise, I want Keir Starmer to succeed, but I don't think he will. And the reason is that the Labour Party have inherited major structural problems, which we can get into if you like, which are not going to be fixed by tinkering with the tax rate at the edges. The room for maneuver is incredibly limited for the Labour Party, for any government at this point. And the problems are massive. They're not going to be addressed in 5 years, and they're certainly not going to be addressed with small, minor changes. So what that likely means is, over the next 5 years, the people who believed that the reason the country is where it is because evil, immoral, out-of-touch elitist Tories were in power, and all we need to do is inject some highly moral, brilliant left-wing people to take over the country and sort all these problems out. They're about to discover that none of the problems that they're concerned about are going to get sorted out, which to me seems to suggest, and this is obviously, we're looking 5 years into the future now, so these projections, 5 years from now may be completely wrong. But my sense is, what is likely to happen is the level of disillusionment with the establishment is likely to rise very significantly over the next 5 years, which means that should Nigel Farage and Reform do the things that they need to do to inject credibility into themselves beyond the 5 MPs that they've got, they need to clean house and get rid of all the really troublesome people who they had stand for them without much background checks and so on. They need to establish credibility. They need to articulate themselves as the kind of the central voice of opposition to the two mainstream parties. Farage needs to be successful in giving speeches in Parliament, etc. If he's able to do all that, then at the next election, depending on how bad the Tory meltdown is, and speaking to people within the Conservative Party, it seems to me that it's going to the ramifications of what just happened are going to run for a long time. Then the next election could represent an opportunity for a populist right of centre party like Reform to make very significant inroads into both the Labour and the Conservative vote. That's kind of what I see. So the big story of this election for me is the rise of Reform, not necessarily reflected in seats. They only got 5 seats on 4 million votes compared to the Lib Dems, who got 71 seats from 3.5 million votes. Fewer votes, 71 seats. So that's what I see as being the key story. the Conservative Party breaking down, losing votes to its right. And then the question is what happens over the next 5 years, as I think, sadly, the country will continue to struggle.
So there's two main streams I'd really like to pick up on there. And the first is shown up in the staggering figures around the number of people who didn't vote. The vote for apathy, the vote against the Tories, whatever it was. The fact is that out of 46 million voters, more than 35 million did not vote for the Labor Party. Only 1 in 3. It is literally 1 in 3 of those who of Brits voted for the Labor Party, and yet that gave them a sweeping control.
I think it's more like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. It's somewhere in between those two, actually.
Right.
And yes, I mean, the headline you'll hear is it's the second lowest turnout for over a century. But the second lowest turnout, the first lowest turnout was in 2001, when basically everyone knew Labour were going to win again. And that was 59.7%. Well, last week, it was 60%. So it's basically the lowest turnout for a century or more. And it just shows you the state of disillusionment with many things.